The golden chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars as wealthy guests filled the grand ballroom of the Riverside Hotel. It was one of those fancy charity events where everyone wore expensive clothes and sipped champagne from crystal glasses. The autumn evening had brought out the city's most influential people, all there to support young musicians and celebrate classical music. Among the crowd was Victor Rousseau, a name that made classical music lovers lean forward in their seats. He had just returned from a sold-out tour across Europe, and critics were calling him one of the greatest pianists alive. Victor moved through the room like he owned it, shaking hands with millionaires and art collectors. His perfectly tailored suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he knew it. When people complimented his recent performances, he would simply nod with a slight smile, as if their praise was expected rather than appreciated. The man had talent. Nobody could deny that. He'd been playing piano since he was 4 years old, trained at the most prestigious music schools in the world, and had won every major competition worth winning. But somewhere along the way, between all the awards and standing ovations, something had changed in Victor. The joy had been replaced by pride. The passion had been buried under perfection. In a quieter corner of that same ballroom, far from the champagne towers and celebrity musicians, sat a 16-year-old girl named Maya Chen with her mother. Maya's white cane leaned against her chair, a constant companion she'd had since she was old enough to walk. She'd been born blind, never seeing a sunset or her mother's face, never watching her own fingers dance across piano keys. But if you asked Maya, she'd tell you she didn't feel like she was missing anything. Her world was rich with sounds, textures, and music that painted pictures words couldn't capture. Maya was there because she'd received a scholarship from the Foundation's youth program. For the past 3 years, she'd been taking piano lessons twice a week, practicing for hours in her small apartment where the neighbors had learned to love Chopin whether they wanted to or not. Her teacher, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, always said Maya had something special. "You don't just hear the notes, dear," she'd say. "You understand what they're trying to say." As Maya sat there, her mother leaned close and whispered descriptions of everything around them. "There's an ice sculpture of a swan near the buffet table, honey. And the ceiling must be 30 feet high, with paintings of angels and clouds. Oh, and that woman walking by has a dress covered in so many sequins she looks like a disco ball." Maya smiled at her mother's commentary. They'd developed this routine over the years, her mother becoming her eyes at events like these. The background music played softly through hidden speakers, some Mozart piece that Maya recognized from her studies. Her fingers unconsciously tapped the rhythm on her lap, following along with the melody. She could hear the slight imperfections in the recording, the places where the pianist had rushed just a tiny bit, where they'd hit a note a fraction too hard. Music wasn't just something Maya heard. It was something she felt in her bones, understood in a language deeper than words. When the announcement came that the evening's main performance was about to begin, the crowd moved toward the rows of chairs facing the stage. Maya's mother gently touched her elbow, guiding her to their seats in the middle section. The excited chatter of 300 people slowly died down as the lights dimmed. Then came the applause, loud and long, as Victor took the stage. Maya heard his footsteps on the wooden stage floor, confident and measured. She heard the piano bench scraping slightly as he adjusted it to his preferred position, then silence, that pregnant pause before a performance begins, when the whole world seems to hold its breath. Victor began playing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding pieces in classical music. And technically perfect was exactly what it was. Every note landed precisely where it should. The tempo was flawless. The dynamics were textbook perfect. Maya could appreciate the skill involved, the thousands of hours of practice required to play with such precision. But something was missing. As she listened, Maya felt like she was hearing a math equation rather than a story. The notes were all correct, but they didn't speak to her heart. It was like watching someone go through the motions of a dance without feeling the music. Beautiful in theory, empty in practice. She thought about how Mrs. Patterson always told her, playing piano isn't about getting every note right. It's about making people feel something, about sharing a piece of your soul through the instrument. Maya leaned toward her mother and whispered, "It's perfect, but it's not alive." Her mother squeezed her hand in acknowledgement, understanding what her daughter meant even if she couldn't quite hear the difference herself. When Victor finished, the crowd erupted in applause. People jumped to their feet, shouting, "Bravo!" and clapping until their hands hurt. Maya stood too, applauding politely, because she respected the skill even if the performance had left her feeling cold. She could hear people around her talking about how incredible it was, how privileged they were to witness such mastery. "That man is a genius," someone said behind her. "Best pianist of our generation." Another voice agreed. Maya said nothing, but she wondered if maybe everyone had been so dazzled by the technical perfection that they'd forgotten to notice the absence of heart. Or maybe she was wrong. Maybe her inexperience was making her critical of something she didn't fully understand. After all, who was she to judge a world-famous pianist? She was just a teenager who'd been playing for 3 years, who couldn't even see the keys beneath her fingers. As the applause finally died down and people returned to their mingling and champagne, Maya felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She was grateful to be there in that beautiful ballroom, part of an event celebrating something she loved so deeply, but she also felt a strange disappointment, like she'd been hoping for something transcendent and gotten something merely excellent instead. Her mother stood and took her arm. "The foundation director wants to introduce some of the scholarship students to Mr. Rousseau," she said quietly. "We don't have to go if you don't want to." Maya hesitated. Part of her wanted to meet the famous pianist, to maybe understand him better, to ask him questions about his relationship with music. But another part of her felt nervous, sensing that maybe this wasn't going to go the way she hoped. "Let's go," she finally said, curiosity winning over caution. She stood, reached for her cane, and let her mother guide her through the crowd toward where Victor was holding court. Surrounded by admirers and foundation board members, neither Maya nor Victor knew it yet, but this meeting would change both of their lives forever. Sometimes the most important moments sneak up on you, disguised as ordinary encounters at charity events. Sometimes a 16-year-old blind girl and a world-famous pianist are about to teach each other lessons neither of them knew they needed to learn. Maya and her mother made their way through the crowd, weaving between clusters of people discussing Victor's performance. The closer they got to where he was standing, the more Maya could hear his voice cutting through the chatter. It was smooth and confident, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to and obeyed. "Ah, here we are," said the foundation director, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, whose nervous energy was almost palpable. Maya could hear it in the way she spoke too quickly, laughed too loudly at things that weren't quite funny. "Mr. Rousseau, I'd like you to meet some of our scholarship recipients. These are the young people your generous donations help support." Maya felt her mother's hand tighten slightly on her arm, a protective instinct that had been there since Maya was a baby. They stepped forward and Mrs. Henderson continued, "This is Maya Chen, one of our most promising young pianists. She's been with the program for 3 years now." There was a pause just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Maya sensed Victor's eyes on her, could almost feel him taking in her white cane. Her slightly unfocused gaze that came from not needing to look directly at people when she spoke to them. She'd experienced these pauses before. That moment when people recalibrated their expectations upon realizing she was blind. "Promising," Victor said finally, and there was something in his tone that made Maya's stomach tighten. It wasn't quite mockery, but it wasn't respect either. It was the verbal equivalent of a pat on the head. "How very optimistic of you, Mrs. Henderson." A small crowd had gathered around them now, board members and donors curious about the scholarship students, probably expecting a heartwarming photo opportunity for the foundation's newsletter. Victor seemed to realize he had an audience, and he played to it like he was still on stage. "You understand, of course," he continued, addressing Mrs. Henderson but really speaking to everyone within earshot, "that piano at the highest level requires more than just good hearing. It requires seeing the instrument, understanding spatial relationships, reading the subtle nuances in a score that go beyond the notes themselves." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Vision is crucial for truly mastering the piano." Maya's mother went rigid beside her. She'd spent 16 years defending her daughter against people who underestimated her, against teachers who said Maya couldn't possibly keep up in regular classes, against strangers who spoke too loudly as if blindness also meant deafness. And here it was again, dressed up in polite language and a fancy suit, but the same old prejudice underneath. "Mr. Rousseau," her mother started, her voice tight with controlled anger. But Maya touched her mother's hand gently, a signal they'd developed over the years. "I've got this, Mom. Let me handle it." "It's admirable that the foundation encourages all students," Victor went on, apparently not done yet. "Inclusivity is important, of course. But we must also be realistic about limitations. Not everyone can reach the same heights, and that's perfectly acceptable. There are many ways to enjoy music without necessarily performing at a professional level." Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few nodded along, agreeing with what they saw as honest, if harsh, truth. Others looked at Maya with pity, that awful sympathy that she hated more than outright rudeness. At least rudeness was honest. Mrs. Henderson let out a nervous laugh, clearly trying to smooth over the situation. "Well, yes, of course we aim to give all our students the best education possible, whatever their goals might be." Maya stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to the left, a habit she had when she was processing something important. She was thinking about Victor's performance, about those technically perfect but emotionally hollow notes. She was thinking about what Mrs. Patterson always said about music coming from the heart, not the eyes. She was thinking about whether she had the courage to say what she was thinking. The crowd was starting to disperse, the awkward moment passing, everyone ready to move on to more comfortable conversations. Victor had already begun turning away, his point made, his wisdom dispensed. "Mr. Rousseau," Maya said, her voice quiet but clear enough to stop him mid-turn. He looked back at her, one eyebrow slightly raised. "Yes? May I ask you a question?" Maya's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it, but her voice stayed steady. "Of course," Victor said, though his tone suggested he was indulging a child. "What did you feel when you played tonight?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victor's expression shifted, confusion flickering across his face. It clearly wasn't the question he'd expected. Maybe he thought she'd ask for advice or defend herself or just thank him for his time. "What did I feel?" he repeated. "Yes," Maya said. "When you were playing Rachmaninoff, what were you feeling? What were you trying to make us feel?" Several people in the crowd stopped moving, sensing that something interesting was happening. Victor's jaw tightened just slightly, a crack in his composed exterior. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking," he said carefully. "I was focused on executing the piece correctly, on honoring the composer's intentions." "That's what I thought," Maya said. And though her words were soft, they cut through the polite atmosphere like a knife, because I heard every note perfectly executed. Every single one was exactly where it should be. Exactly the right volume, exactly the right tempo, but I didn't feel your heart in any of them. Someone in the crowd gasped quietly. Mrs. Henderson looked like she might faint. Maya's mother squeezed her daughter's hand, proud and terrified at the same time. Nobody spoke to Victor Rousseau like this. He was a legend, a master, someone you treated with reverence and respect. Victor's face flushed slightly, a hint of red creeping up his neck. His hands clenched at his sides. For a long moment he just stared at Maya, and she could feel the weight of his anger even though she couldn't see it. "You're 16 years old," he said, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. "You've been playing for 3 years, and you think you're qualified to critique my artistry?" "I'm not critiquing your technique," Maya said, and she was trembling now, but she couldn't stop. The words were coming out and they needed to be said. "Your technique is incredible. I could never play like that, you're right about that. But playing all the notes correctly isn't the same as making music. Music is supposed to touch people, to make them feel something real, and tonight I felt nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. A few people in the crowd pulled out their phones, sensing that something was happening, something worth recording. Others exchanged glances, shocked by the audacity of this blind teenager talking back to one of the world's greatest pianists. Victor took a step closer to Maya, looking down at her. "It's very easy to critique from the audience," he said coldly. "Very easy to have opinions when you've never faced the pressure of performing for 300 people, when you've never had to deliver perfection night after night. Performance is an entirely different matter from sitting in a classroom with a patient teacher." "Then let me show you," Maya heard herself say, and even as the words left her mouth, she couldn't quite believe she was saying them. "I'm sorry?" Victor said. Maya's heart was racing, her palms sweating, but she'd gone this far and there was no turning back now. "Let me perform. Let me show you that feeling matters more than seeing, that music comes from somewhere deeper than perfect technique." Mrs. Henderson made a strangled sound. Maya, dear, I don't think you want to play, Victor interrupted. And now there was something like amusement in his voice, the way you'd be amused by a puppy challenging a wolf. You want to perform right here, right now, in front of all these people? Yes, Maya said simply. Victor smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to teach a lesson, who was going to put an arrogant child in her place. Very well, he said. The piano is still on stage. Please enlighten us all. Maya's mother bent close to her ear. Honey, you don't have to do this. We can just leave, but Maya shook her head. Something had ignited inside her, something that had been building during Victor's performance, during his dismissive words about limitations and realism. She was tired of people telling her what she couldn't do. She was tired of being patted on the head and praised for trying. She wanted to be heard, really heard, not as a blind girl playing piano, but as a musician who had something to say. I need to do this, Mom, she whispered back. Her mother took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, baby. I'm right here with you. Together they began walking toward the stage, Maya's cane tapping against the polished floor, her mother's hand guiding her elbow. Behind them, the crowd followed, whispers spreading like wildfire through the ballroom. Word was traveling fast. The blind scholarship student was going to perform. This was either going to be incredibly inspiring or incredibly embarrassing, and nobody wanted to miss it. Victor stood near the stage, arms crossed over his chest, that cold smile still on his face. He was absolutely certain about what was going to happen next. This naive, overconfident girl was about to learn the hardest lesson of her young life, and honestly, he thought maybe she needed to learn it. The world was too full of people with unrealistic dreams. Better she learn now that some limitations couldn't be overcome with passion and wishful thinking. He had no idea he was wrong. He had no idea that in the next few minutes everything he thought he knew about music was about to be turned upside down. Maya's mother helped her up the 3 steps to the stage, her hand steady, even though Maya could feel the slight tremor in it. Her mom was scared for her, scared she'd be humiliated in front of all these people. But she was also proud. Maya could sense that too. Proud that her daughter had the courage to stand up for herself, to demand to be heard. The grand piano sat center stage, its black surface gleaming under the lights. Maya's mother guided her to the bench, and Maya sat down slowly, taking a moment to orient herself. She could hear the crowd settling into their seats, the rustling of fabric, the clearing of throats, the whispered conversations that hadn't quite died down yet. She heard phone cameras clicking on, ready to record whatever was about to happen. Do you need help finding the keys, dear? Mrs. Henderson called from somewhere in the audience, her voice dripping with that awful pity again. No, thank you, Maya said politely. She placed her cane carefully beside the bench where she could find it later, then lifted her hands to the keyboard. Her fingers touched the cool ivory keys gently, almost like greeting an old friend. She started at middle C and let her hands drift outward, mapping the familiar landscape of the piano. Every key was where it should be, exactly as she knew it would be. Her teacher always said that Maya had a gift for spatial memory, that once she learned the geography of an instrument, it became as natural to her as walking. Maya took a deep breath, then another and a third. Mrs. Patterson had taught her this. A ritual before performing. Center yourself, her teacher would say. Let the noise of the world fall away. It's just you and the music, nothing else matters. The crowd's whispers faded as people realized she was about to begin. Victor stood off to the side of the stage, his arms still crossed, his expression skeptical. In his mind, this was already over. The girl would play something simple, maybe make it through without too many mistakes, and everyone would applaud politely, and then they could all move on with their evening. Maya's hands settled into position. She'd thought carefully about what to play during the walk to the stage. She needed something powerful, something that would prove her point, not a gentle piece that people could dismiss as pretty or nice for her level. She needed something that demanded to be taken seriously. She chose Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, but not the first movement that everyone knew, the one that got played at every student recital. No, she was going to play the third movement, the one that exploded with fury and passion, the one that required not just technical skill but emotional courage. Her fingers struck the first notes, and immediately the energy in the room changed. The opening was fast, aggressive, demanding attention. Maya's hands flew across the keys with a speed that made several people in the audience lean forward in surprise. This wasn't what they'd expected from a 16-year-old scholarship student, but speed alone wasn't what made people's breath catch in their throats. It was the way she played. Every note carried weight, carried meaning. Where Victor's performance had been about precision, Maya's was about expression. She wasn't trying to play perfectly. She was trying to tell a story, to share something raw and real. Her body moved with the music, swaying slightly, her head tilting back during the crescendos, leaning forward during the delicate passages. She wasn't performing for the audience. She was having a conversation with the piano, with Beethoven's ghost, with something deeper than any of them could see. The third movement of the Moonlight Sonata is a journey through darkness and light, through fury and resolution. And Maya understood that journey in a way that went beyond the notes on a page. She understood what it felt like to fight against the world's low expectations, to push back against people who told you what you couldn't do. Every explosive chord was defiance. Every delicate run was hope. Victor's expression had changed completely. His arms slowly uncrossed and fell to his sides. He took a step closer to the piano, then another, drawn by what he was hearing. This wasn't possible. This girl, this blind teenager who'd been playing for only 3 years, was doing something he hadn't heard in decades. She was making the piano sing in a way that transcended technique. In the audience, people had stopped whispering entirely. Several had tears streaming down their faces, though they couldn't have explained exactly why. The music was touching something in them, reaching past their defenses, finding the places where they kept their own struggles and dreams and disappointments. An elderly woman in the third row clutched her husband's hand, remembering her own daughter who'd given up piano years ago. A young man in the back found himself thinking about the artwork he'd stopped creating because someone told him he wasn't good enough. Maya was completely lost in the music now. Her fingers knew where to go without conscious thought. She'd practiced this piece hundreds of times in her small apartment, had felt every emotion it contained, had made it her own. This wasn't Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata anymore. It was Maya's story, translated into a language that everyone in that room could understand even if they couldn't put it into words. The technical difficulty of the piece was immense. There were moments where she had to stretch her hands across octaves at lightning speed, moments where one tiny mistake would derail everything. But Maya didn't make mistakes. Not because she was perfect, but because she was so completely present in the moment that her fingers simply went where they needed to go. Mrs. Patterson, sitting near the back of the room, had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears running freely down her wrinkled cheeks. She'd known Maya was special, had always known it. But seeing her student perform like this, with this level of maturity and emotional depth, was almost overwhelming. This was why she'd spent 50 years teaching piano. For moments like this, when a student didn't just learn to play an instrument but learned to speak a language that transcended words, Victor felt something cracking inside his chest, something that had been frozen for years. When had he stopped playing like this? When had music become about perfection instead of expression? About impressing audiences instead of moving them? He'd been playing piano since he was 4 years old, had won his first major competition at 12, had been called a prodigy and a genius and a master, but somewhere in all of that success, he'd lost something essential. He'd forgotten why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Maya reached the final section of the piece, the resolution where all the fury and chaos finally found peace. Her playing softened, became almost tender, like a lullaby after a storm. The notes fell like raindrops, each one perfectly placed, each one necessary. And then, with one final chord, she finished. Her hands lifted from the keys and settled in her lap. She sat perfectly still, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths, coming back to herself from wherever the music had taken her. The sound of that final chord hung in the air, reverberating through the silent ballroom. For 5 full seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The silence was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Then the applause began. It started with one person, then 2, then suddenly the entire ballroom was on their feet. The sound was deafening, not the polite appreciation they'd given Victor, but something wild and genuine. People were shouting, calling out bravo, and incredible. Some were clapping so hard their hands would be sore later. Others were wiping tears from their faces, not even trying to hide their emotions. Maya sat at the piano bench, slightly dazed, not quite sure what was happening. The wall of sound washed over her, and she felt her mother's hands on her shoulders, Could hear her mom crying and laughing at the same time. Mrs. Henderson was screaming something congratulatory. Strangers were calling her name. But the person Maya was most aware of was Victor. She heard his footsteps on the stage, quick and purposeful. He was walking toward her, and she turned her head in his direction, waiting for whatever was about to happen next. Victor stopped right in front of her. The audience quieted down slightly, curious about what the famous pianist would say or do. This was his moment to either accept what had just happened or to try to save face, to make excuses about acoustics or luck or beginner's enthusiasm. Instead, Victor did something that shocked every single person in that room. He knelt down beside the piano bench, took Maya's hand in both of his, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion and loud enough for everyone to hear. "I have been a fool," he said, and there were tears in his voice. "A complete and utter fool. You have just taught me the most important lesson of my entire career." Maya's mouth opened slightly in surprise. This wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected anger, maybe, or dismissal, or at best a grudging admission that she could play adequately. "I heard music tonight," Victor continued, his grip on her hand tightening. "Really heard it, felt it, understood it for the first time in years. Maybe decades. You were right about my performance. Every note was correct, but my heart wasn't in it. I'd forgotten how to do what you just did. I'd forgotten that music isn't about perfection. It's about truth." The ballroom had gone silent again, everyone straining to hear what Victor was saying. Phones were recording, catching every word of what was clearly a moment that would be talked about for years. "Thank you," Victor said simply. "From the bottom of my heart, thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with the piano 40 years ago." And Maya, this 16-year-old girl who'd been dismissed and doubted and patted on the head, smiled and said the only thing she could think to say. "You're welcome. Mr. Rousseau, maybe we could learn from each other." Victor stood up slowly, still holding Maya's hand, and turned to face the audience. The crowd was absolutely transfixed, phones still recording, nobody wanting to miss a single second of what was unfolding. This was the kind of moment people would talk about for years. The kind of story that would spread across social media and music forums and dinner table conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the same command he used when performing, but now with a warmth that hadn't been there before. "I came here tonight as a teacher intending to give. Instead, I have been taught. I have been humbled. And I have been reminded of a truth I'd forgotten." He paused, looking down at Maya, who sat perfectly still at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, her expression somewhere between bewildered and calm. She'd defended herself, proven her point, but she hadn't expected this reaction. Nobody could have expected this. "Music," Victor continued, "is not about what you can see. It's about what you can feel, and this young woman feels more deeply than I have allowed myself to feel in a very long time." He turned back to Maya. "Would you do me the honor of playing with me? Not teacher and student, but as equals. As musicians sharing a moment." The crowd erupted again, applause and excited chatter mixing together. Maya's mother, still standing near the stage, had her hands pressed to her heart, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Henderson looked like she might actually faint this time, gripping the back of a chair for support. This was beyond anything anyone had imagined. Maya felt her heart hammering in her chest. Play with Victor Rousseau? The Victor Rousseau? A duet with one of the greatest pianists in the world? She wanted to say yes immediately, but a small voice in her head whispered doubts. What if she messed up? What if she couldn't keep up with him? What if this was all just a setup to humiliate her further? But then she remembered how his voice had sounded when he thanked her, the genuine emotion in it, and she remembered Mrs. Patterson's words from just last week. The biggest mistake you can make, Maya, is letting fear keep you from opportunities. Say yes to life even when it's scary. I'd be honored, Maya said quietly, then louder. Yes, I'd love to, Victor smiled. A real smile this time, not the cold, superior expression he'd worn earlier. He moved to the left side of the piano bench, making room for Maya to scoot over. They sat side by side, and Maya could feel the warmth of another person next to her, could hear his breathing steady and calm. Have you ever improvised? Victor asked her softly, speaking just to her now, the audience forgotten for a moment. A little, Maya admitted. Mrs. Patterson says I'm better at playing written music. Then we'll create something together, Victor said. I'll start, you respond. No right or wrong, just conversation. Can you do that? Maya nodded, her throat tight with nervous excitement. Her hands found the keys again, settling into their familiar positions. Victor began with something simple, a gentle melodic phrase in the upper register, something that sounded like a question being asked. It was soft and searching, tender in a way his earlier performance hadn't been. He was being vulnerable now, offering something honest. Maya listened, letting the notes settle into her mind, feeling their shape and color. Then her hands moved to the middle register, and she answered with a harmonic compliment, something that felt like it belonged with what he'd played. Her response was warmer, adding depth and richness to his question. Victor glanced at her with surprise and pleasure. She'd understood him, had heard what he was trying to say, and responded in kind. He played again, building on what she'd added, taking the melody in a new direction, something slightly more complex. Back and forth they went, creating music that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. It was like watching two people have a conversation in a language only they understood, building ideas together, responding to each other's emotions and musical choices. The audience watched in absolute awe. What they were witnessing wasn't just technically impressive, though it was that too. What made it extraordinary was the connection between the two pianists, the way they seemed to understand each other through the music. Victor would play something melancholy and Maya would answer with hope. She would play something playful, and he would respond with laughter translated into notes. At one point, Victor introduced a minor key progression, something darker and more complex, testing to see if Maya could follow. Without missing a beat, she not only followed but transformed it, taking his darkness and finding light within it, showing him that even sad music could be beautiful. That pain didn't have to be the end of the story. Victor felt tears building behind his eyes. When was the last time he'd cried while playing? When was the last time music had moved him like this? He'd spent so many years focused on precision, on critics' reviews, on maintaining his reputation as the best. He'd forgotten that music was supposed to make you feel, supposed to connect you to something larger than yourself. His playing changed as the improvisation continued. He stopped trying to impress and started trying to communicate. He let his fingers find notes that surprised even him. Let the music lead instead of controlling every single sound, and it felt like coming home after being lost for years. Maya could feel the shift in Victor's playing. He was opening up, becoming more honest, more real. The stiffness was gone, replaced by fluidity and genuine expression. They were really playing together now, not competing but collaborating, creating something neither could have made alone. The improvisation built to a natural crescendo, both of them playing together now, their hands moving across the keys in a dance of sound. The music swelled and filled the ballroom, reaching into every corner, touching every heart. And then, as if they'd planned it all along, they both felt the ending approaching, felt the moment when the conversation needed to conclude. They slowed together, the notes becoming softer, more sparse, like the last words before goodbye. Victor played a final questioning phrase, and Maya answered with resolution, bringing their musical dialogue to a peaceful close. Their hands lifted from the keys at the exact same moment, and they both exhaled, coming back to reality together. The silence lasted even longer this time. 10 seconds, maybe 15. The audience seemed unable to process what they'd just witnessed, unable to reduce it to words or applause or anything that would adequately capture it. Then the standing ovation came again, even louder than before. People were on their feet, screaming, crying, clapping until their hands hurt. Some were hugging strangers next to them, overcome with emotion. The elderly woman in the third row was sobbing openly, her husband holding her close. The young man in the back was already pulling up contact information for art schools on his phone, deciding right then that he wasn't going to give up on his dreams. Victor turned to Maya and impulsively he hugged her. It was brief and respectful but genuine. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. "Thank you for giving me back something I thought I'd lost forever." When they pulled apart, Maya was crying too, tears running down her cheeks. "I can't believe that just happened," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Believe it," Victor said, "and believe this too. I meant what I said about learning from each other. If you're willing, I'd like to work with you. Not as your superior, but as a colleague. I think we have a lot to teach one another." Maya's mother had made her way onto the stage now, and she pulled her daughter into a fierce hug. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered. So incredibly proud. Mrs. Henderson was right behind her, and even the stern foundation director was crying. Maya, that was extraordinary. Just extraordinary. Other scholarship students had gathered at the edge of the stage looking at Maya with new respect and admiration. She wasn't just the blind girl anymore. She was the pianist who'd challenged Victor Rousseau, and not only survived but thrived. She was proof that limitations were often just lack of imagination, that being different didn't mean being less. Victor stepped to the edge of the stage, addressing the crowd one more time. Tonight I learned that I have been blind while Maya has been seeing more clearly than any of us. The foundation has my complete and unconditional support going forward. And more than that, I'm committing to mentor Maya personally, if she'll have me. The crowd erupted once more. Donations to the foundation would triple after tonight. Stories about what happened would spread across the internet before the evening was over. Video clips of Maya's performance and the impromptu duet would be watched millions of times. But none of that mattered to Maya in that moment. What mattered was that she'd found her voice, had proven to herself and everyone else that she belonged in the world of music, not despite her blindness but as a complete talented musician who happened to be blind. What mattered was that she'd stood up for herself and won not through defeating someone else, but through showing them a truth they'd forgotten. And what mattered to Victor was that he'd been given a second chance, a reminder of why he'd devoted his life to music in the first place. He'd been drowning in perfection, and Maya had thrown him a lifeline back to passion. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, still talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed, Victor sat with Maya and her mother in a quiet corner, exchanging phone numbers, discussing music, making plans. Mrs. Patterson joined them, embracing her student with pride and joy. "You did it, dear," the old teacher said. "You showed them all." "No," Maya said softly. "I just played the way you taught me, from the heart." Victor listened to this exchange and felt another wave of emotion wash over him. How long had it been since he'd played from the heart? How many performances had he given where the notes were perfect but the soul was missing? "I have a proposition," he said suddenly. "I'm scheduled to perform at Carnegie Hall in 3 months. Maya, would you consider performing with me? A proper duet prepared and rehearsed, not improvised." Maya's mouth fell open. Carnegie Hall? That was every musician's dream. I don't know what to say. "Say yes," her mother urged, squeezing her hand. Maya sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what Victor had just offered. Carnegie Hall, the most prestigious concert venue in the world, the place where legends performed, where careers were made or broken. And he wanted her to perform there with him. "Yes," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, then louder with more confidence. "Yes, I'll do it." Victor smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression that nobody in that room had seen before tonight. "Excellent. We'll need to practice together, of course. I'll arrange my schedule. Perhaps twice a week to start." Maya's mother looked concerned. "Mr. Rousseau, that's incredibly generous. But we can't afford private lessons with someone of your caliber. The scholarship covers Mrs. Patterson's fees, but..." Victor held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Please, I wouldn't dream of charging for this. If anything, Maya is doing me the favor. I need this as much as she does, perhaps more." He turned to Mrs. Patterson. "With your permission, of course. I'm not trying to replace you as her teacher." Mrs. Patterson laughed, wiping fresh tears from her wrinkled cheeks. "Mr. Rousseau, if I stood in the way of this opportunity, I'd never forgive myself. Maya will always be my student, but she's ready for more than I can teach her now. She needs someone who can challenge her at a higher level. Then perhaps we could work together," Victor suggested. "You know Maya, know how she learns best. I could use that insight." The old piano teacher nodded, touched by his humility. This wasn't the arrogant man who'd walked onto that stage a few hours ago. Something fundamental had shifted in Victor Rousseau tonight, and everyone around him could feel it. As the last guests filtered out of the ballroom, still buzzing with excitement about what they'd witnessed, Maya sat at a quiet table with her mother, Mrs. Patterson and Victor discussing details. The foundation's photographer had asked to take pictures, and Victor had insisted on getting Maya's permission first, treating her like a professional colleague rather than a charity case. "I have to admit something," Victor said, his voice lower now, more intimate in the smaller group. "When I first saw you tonight, Maya, I made assumptions. Terrible, unfair assumptions. I let my own arrogance blind me to possibilities I should have considered. We all make assumptions, Maya said quietly. People assume things about me every day because they see the cane before they see me. That doesn't make it right, Victor insisted. And it doesn't excuse my behavior. I was cruel, and I'm sorry. Maya tilted her head, considering his apology. You know what's funny? If you hadn't said those things, I never would have had the courage to challenge you. I would have just gone home, maybe complained to my mom about it, but I wouldn't have done anything. Your words made me angry enough to be brave. Victor laughed, but it was a sad sound. I'm not sure I deserve to have my cruelty reframed as a gift, but I appreciate the generosity. He paused, then continued. Can I ask you something? When did you realize that my playing was missing something? Maya thought about it. I think I always play music with my whole body, my whole heart, because I can't rely on sheet music or watching other people. I have to feel it internally. So when I listen to other people play, I hear whether they're feeling it too. With you tonight, it was like listening to someone recite a poem in a language they don't understand. All the words were right, but the meaning wasn't there. Victor nodded slowly. You're absolutely right. I've been so focused on perfection for so long that I forgot about connection. Every critic, every review, every competition, they all judge you on technical execution. Miss one note and they'll write about it. Play with too much emotion and they call you undisciplined. I let that fear of judgment turn my music into something cold and calculated. But it doesn't have to be like that anymore, Maya said. Right? You can change it. With your help, I hope to, Victor said. Starting tonight, I'm approaching music differently. And I'm approaching how I teach differently, too. Over the next 3 months, Victor and Maya met twice a week in his private studio, a beautiful room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. True to his word, he treated her as a colleague, not a student. They challenged each other, debated interpretations of pieces, and pushed one another to go deeper emotionally in their playing. Victor found himself learning as much as teaching. Maya's approach to music, born from necessity, had given her insights that he'd never considered. She taught him to close his eyes while playing sometimes, to focus purely on the sound and feeling rather than the visual. She taught him to think about music as storytelling rather than execution. And Victor taught Maya too. He helped her tackle more complex pieces, showed her techniques for difficult passages, and shared the wisdom of his 40 years of experience. But more than technical knowledge, he taught her confidence. He treated her like a professional, which helped her see herself that way too. Mrs. Patterson came to some of their sessions, offering her perspective and beaming with pride at how much Maya was growing. The three of them formed an unlikely team, united by their love of music and their commitment to helping Maya shine. As Carnegie Hall approached, word had spread about the upcoming performance. The story of the blind teenager and the famous pianist had gone viral. News outlets wanted interviews. Social media was buzzing with anticipation. Tickets sold out within hours. Maya felt the pressure building. What if she froze on stage? What if she made mistakes? What if everyone was disappointed? But Victor noticed her anxiety and sat her down 1 week before the performance. Maya, I need you to understand something, he said gently. Whatever happens on that stage, you've already succeeded. You've already changed lives, starting with mine. The performance is just a moment. What matters is that you keep playing, keep feeling, keep being honest with your music. But what if I mess up in front of all those people? Maya asked, voicing her deepest fear. Then you mess up, Victor said simply. Some of the most memorable performances in history included mistakes. What people remember is whether you moved them, whether you made them feel something real, and you will, because you always do. The night of the Carnegie Hall performance arrived. Maya stood backstage with her mother, her hands trembling slightly as she heard the crowd filling the famous hall. 3,000 people were out there waiting to see if the viral story was real or just social media hype. Victor found her in the green room, calm and centered in a way he hadn't been before a performance in years. Ready? He asked. Terrified, Maya admitted with a small laugh. Good, Victor said. That means you care. Now let's go show them what music is supposed to sound like. They walked onto the stage together to thunderous applause. Maya felt Victor's hand on her elbow, guiding her to the piano. Then he stepped back to let her sit first before taking his own seat beside her. The crowd quieted, and in that moment of silence before they began, Maya thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of practice in her small apartment, Mrs. Patterson's patient teaching, the charity gala where she'd been mocked and found her courage. All of it had brought her here. Victor and Maya began to play their prepared piece, a duet arrangement of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue that they'd spent months perfecting. But they didn't play it perfectly. There were small moments where they deviated from what they'd rehearsed, following feeling instead of plan. There were passages where emotion made their timing just slightly imperfect, and it was beautiful. The audience heard every note, but more importantly, they felt every emotion. They heard two musicians who respected each other, who brought out the best in each other, who understood that music was about human connection rather than human perfection. By the final notes, many in the audience were crying openly, moved by something they couldn't quite put into words. The standing ovation lasted for 5 full minutes. Victor and Maya stood together, holding hands and bowing to the audience. When they finally left the stage, Victor pulled Maya into a hug. "You did it," he said. "You changed the night again. You changed everything." But Maya knew that wasn't quite right. They'd changed things together. Victor had learned to play with his heart again, and she'd learned that her voice deserved to be heard. They'd both grown, both transformed, both become better musicians and better people through their unlikely friendship. 6 months later, Maya was accepted to Juilliard with a full scholarship. Victor continued to mentor her, but also began teaching differently at the masterclasses he led around the world. He talked about Maya in interviews, shared their story, and encouraged other teachers to look beyond traditional limitations. The story of the blind girl and the world-class pianist became legendary in music circles. But for Maya and Victor, it was never really about that one night or even about the Carnegie Hall performance. It was about what they'd learned from each other and how they'd both found their way back to what music was supposed to be. Maya continued to face challenges and prejudice throughout her career. Some people would always see her blindness before her talent, but now she knew how to respond, knew her worth, knew that her different way of experiencing music was a strength rather than a weakness. And Victor never forgot the lesson that 16-year-old girl taught him. He played every performance after that night with more heart, more vulnerability, more honesty. His reviews changed too. Critics noted a new depth to his playing, an emotional quality that had been missing before. Sometimes the most important teachers come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes the person you think needs help is actually the one with the answers you've been searching for. And sometimes a single moment of courage can change not just one night, but the entire trajectory of multiple lives. Maya kept her mother's words from that first night close to her heart. "I'm so proud of you, baby," because she'd learned that pride wasn't about being perfect or proving doubters wrong. It was about being brave enough to show up as yourself, to share your truth, and to believe that your voice matters. The piano doesn't care if you can see it. It only cares if you can feel it. And Maya felt everything.